voices you may hear during the webinar. As I mentioned, I'm Julia Isaacs. I'm the Director of the Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation. In planning this webinar, I've been supported by Teresa Derrick Mills, who's the Deputy Project Director of the Center, and Eleanor Lauterbach, the Project Manager. The Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation is supported through the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, OPRE, in the Administration for Children and Families, ACF, and it's managed through a contract with the Urban Institute. I'd like to thank Meryl Borofsky and Elisa Blandon, who are our OPRE project officers. Our goal of the Center is to support you, CCDF lead agencies, in building your research and evaluation capacity, particularly supporting your capacity to evaluate the policy changes you are making in response to the 2014 reauthorization of CCDBG. Our main activities are this webinar series, some written briefs, and I'll share those in my final slide. And we've also been doing work supporting 11 CCDF lead agencies who had CCDBG implementation, research, and evaluation planning grants and/or implementation grants. And both of today's presenters work on those grants, the grant to Pennsylvania and the one to Wisconsin. So today's webinar topic builds on the webinar that we held several months ago in July. That one focused on a dozen policy questions you can answer with your agency's administrative data. Today we are assuming you are again starting with your own administrative data, but are going beyond it and comparing your administrative data to other data. Before we talk about the new topic, I'm going to spend one slide briefly recapping a few tips on administrative data from the July webinar. So some advantages to the administrative data is it's data that you have access to, often usually at lower cost than other data. And some of the staff are knowledgeable about the data, and administrative data are often available over time. However, an important caveat is that data quality really varies. Some fields may be accurate, while others may have lots of missing data. There also are limitations in your data systems, including technology issues affecting what you can access, as well as data limitations in terms of what types of data are actually collected. Finally, maybe to state the obvious, but it bears repeating, your administrative data, while a good source of information on program participants, tells you nothing about the people who do not participate in your program. For that, you need to turn to other data. So, the topic of today's webinar is mapping answers to childcare questions, comparing your administrative data with other data. More specifically, we are talking about comparing supply with potential demand. And when I think of for the childcare supply, I'm thinking you'll usually be turning to your own agency administrative data about childcare providers. There's information in the licensing data. In the subsidy data, you may have information about some license-exempt providers, and you may have other lists of providers. For the demand side, you usually want to turn to the Census Bureau's household surveys that provide various estimates of the population of families and children that may demand childcare. I label this potential demand because not all families with children will actually want to take up or participate in formal childcare. The American Community Survey or other Census Bureau data sets, like the decennial census, may be sources of data here. And you may look at children of a certain age, but obviously you probably will look at children of a certain age. But you also might want to refine it further and look at children whose families have income below a certain threshold or certain parental work status. Our presenters will say more about this. Before I go on, I just do want to say that to state the obvious, but it bears repeating, both the supply and potential demand data have limitations. We discussed the limitations of the administrative data on the previous slide. Of course, survey data also has limitations, like it lags in time. The estimates are less precise as you go in small population areas because it's based on a survey. Sometimes you can correct this by rolling several years of survey data together. And of course, again, you may not have all the data you need. You just have what was collected on the survey. Our presenters will talk more about these limitations. So today we'll be talking about mapping as one way, a powerful way, that you can analyze and show differences between supply and demand. So in this, hour and 15-minute webinar, we'll only have time to show a few of the many different types of maps that are possible. For example, Erica will show maps that show differences in demand, showing which areas have the highest number of children. And all of our presenters will show maps that depict the location of providers in a particular state or county or region. And then we'll see some maps where they're maps that show supply and demand together, such as Childcare Deserts or other types of maps. So to tell us more about mapping, I'd like to introduce my colleague Erica Greenberg, which she's sitting across the table from me, but she's also pictured on this slide. Erica is a Senior Research Associate here at the Urban Institute.
Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll do a quick overview of Mapping 101. You can think of mapping as having two main purposes. First, mapping offers a powerful tool for data visualization, also thought of as data presentation. Under this purpose, administrative, census, and other data can be plotted with the goal of boosting understanding of existing information. Importantly, other types of data visualization and tabling can fulfill this purpose in coordination with or independent of mapping. Second, mapping is a powerful tool for spatial analysis. Here, similar types of data are displayed with the goal of creating new understanding of spatial patterns using geographic information. To fulfill this purpose, mapping is often the only or best approach. Today's webinar will feature examples of both purposes of mapping. I'd like to start out with some key terms to provide us with common vocabulary on mapping. A Geographic Information System, or GIS, is a system that holds, analyzes, and visualizes spatial information and facilitates spatial thinking. A shapefile is a data file that includes geographic information in points, lines, or polygons. Geocoding is a process that takes address information, for example, street number, city, state, and zip code, and converts it into latitude and longitude coordinates for mapping. Finally, projection is a process of transformation that converts a three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional map or converts one type of 2D map to another. This is a technical process worthy of more discussion, but I mention it here for the simple reason that projection is the source of most mapping troubles. For example, if you have multiple files that don't line up or somehow look off in your GIS, the first place to troubleshoot is projection. The next set of key terms to define are those related to census geographies. When trying to estimate demand or potential demand for childcare, or to characterize a population, for example, young children ages birth through 5, or subsidy-eligible children with parents working non-traditional hours, data from the U.S. Census and census-type sources like the American Community Survey, or ACS, are often your best bet. Here is a simplified hierarchy of census geographies. We have the nation as a whole, followed by states, then counties within states, then census tracts, which are intended to represent neighborhoods with about 4,000 inhabitants on average, then block groups, and then smallest census blocks. In addition to these data types, or geography types, administrative and census data may be available by zip code, also known as zip code tabulation area, or ZCTA, which can cross state boundaries in some instances, and by other geographies like congressional or school districts and public use microdata areas, or PUMAs. As many of you know already, there can be trade-offs in defining the geographies of demand and comparing supply and demand. Smaller geographies are more precise, but may be more restrictive than families' true child care search. Larger geographies may have the opposite problem. Because census geographies are based on population, some may have more variability in area size versus more similarity, depending on where your project is focused. The ACS and other data sources based on samples rather than a census have trade-offs in 1 versus 5-year estimates as well. 1-year estimates are best suited to showing change over time, but they may not be able to support data disaggregation and identify narrow target populations as well as 5-year estimates often can. Once you're ready to embark on a mapping project, there are many different software options available to facilitate your work. Here is a short list in no particular order and with no particular endorsements. Excel now supports mapping through a link with the search engine Bing. Tableau is a broad data visualization platform that includes mapping. ArcGIS is the industry standard and has a wide array of geospatial tools. It's also very expensive and sometimes a cumbersome option for more straightforward projects. QGIS is a free open source version of ArcGIS. MapInfo and Google Maps now support map customization, and there are many more options evolving all the time. Now we're going to move into some examples of common types of maps from real child care supply and demand projects. Each map relates to the mapping purposes of data visualization, spatial analysis, or both. Our first type of map is a Coroplast. Coroplast maps facilitate data visualization and involve coloring or shading geographic areas based on underlying data. This map comes from a study I worked on with Teresa Derrick Mills and study principal investigator Heather Sandstrom, focused on non-traditional hour childcare in the District of Columbia, published by the Urban Institute. This map shows potential demand for non-traditional hour childcare by estimating the number of children ages 12 and under whose parents work or commute during non-traditional hours. We calculated potential demand using a 5-year file of American Community Survey microdata with adjustments made to identify the target population. This map shows large numbers of children, between 3,300 and 4,470 in Ward 7 and Ward 8 in the District of Columbia, potentially needing child care during non-traditional hours. These are the wards with the highest demand. Fewer children, between 1,740 and 3,290, are part of potential demand in Ward 4 and Ward 5, respectively. And then fewer children still, between 840 and 1,730, are part of potential demand in each Ward 1, Ward 2, Ward 3, and Ward 6. Next, we have a dot or dot density map. Back one slide, please.
Have one more? Yeah, my hand was too heavy.
That's great. This type of map is primarily used for data analysis, meaning that it offers new information that goes beyond the underlying data. A dot or dot density map features points that represent one or many individuals, organizations, or other units. This map comes from the same study cited on the previous slide. Here we are mapping the supply of licensed child development facilities using the District of Columbia Office of the State Superintendent of Education export of child development facilities licensing files. We plot centers in blue and homes in gold, and we have a dark shade for non-traditional hour facilities and a light shade for traditional hour facilities. So 4 colors of dots in all. This map shows that facilities are not distributed evenly across DC. Non-traditional hour centers are clustered downtown in the eastern half of the district, while non-traditional hour homes are clustered in the east as well. Facilities are often located along major roads, as you can see from the underlying base map. This kind of map can facilitate much more detailed visual analysis, but I'll stop there for now. This next map draws on the strengths of the previous two. It is a combined Coroplast DotMap showing distribution of legally exempt home-based providers that accept subsidy relative to the population of subsidy-eligible children with parents working early mornings in Nassau County, New York. This map comes from a study I worked on with Heather Sandstrom, Julia Henley, Amy Claysons, and our colleagues for the OPRE-funded Illinois-New York Child Care Research Partnership. It was included in a 2018 report published by the Urban Institute. Data on the supply of legally exempt home-based providers come from New York State subsidy program records, while data on demand among such subsidy-eligible children with parents working early mornings come from our estimates using a 3-year file of the American Community Survey. As you can see, the map shows the greatest number of legally exempt home-based providers clustered with the greatest number of subsidy-eligible children with parents working early mornings. Both supply and demand are concentrated in the southwest section of Nassau County. The map also shows several providers spread out throughout the county in communities with low numbers of subsidy-eligible children potentially needing care in the early morning. Further research might explore whether those providers are operating at capacity, whether nearby families need care during other non-traditional hours, and how existing supply may or may not meet demand. Finally, we include examples of a type of map used for sophisticated data analysis, a heat map. Heat maps analyze the intensity of the occurrence of data points and use statistical testing to assess whether the clustering of points is more or less than would be expected by chance. Heat maps identify hot spots with tight clustering of points and cold spots with few highly dispersed points. These examples come from a study by Anna Shapiro, Eleanor Martin, Christina Weiland, and Rebecca Unterman published this year in AERA Open. The study is titled, If You Offer It, Will They Come? Patterns of Application and Enrollment Behavior in a Universal Pre-Kindergarten Context. Here, the authors use pre-kindergarten lottery application files from Boston Public Schools to show hot and cold spots of pre-K appliers in the map on the left and non-appliers in the map on the right. There are many possible takeaways from these maps, along with other data presented in the paper. The authors highlight that non-appliers are clustered in neighborhoods with more people of color, more people who speak a language other than English, more unemployed people, and more people living under the poverty line. They conclude that fewer families in less advantaged communities are applying to Boston's pre-K program, meaning that the program may not be satisfying equity goals. These examples are just a small set of maps possible to create using available software and administrative data on child care supply and demand. When considering whether to take on mapping projects like these, it is important to remember that mapping can help researchers inform broad and diverse audiences, including policymakers and providers. To have the greatest impact, consider tailoring maps and related writing to each intended audience. When possible, pilot maps with members of each intended audience to check for understanding, and then adjust as needed. Also remember to be mindful of accessibility in print and on screen, including for people who are colorblind. Make sure maps convey the same information whether they are printed in black and white or in color, and select colors distinguishable by people who are colorblind, for example, avoiding a contrast between red and green. I'll close with some caveats. First, mapping is powerful. Take care. Be clear about your underlying data and its limitations, and assess color gradients, symbol used, geographic scale, and other features to ensure appropriate interpretation. Second, remember that mapping is not always the best approach to visualizing data. This is an unusual point to end on, but an important one nonetheless. Before embarking on a new project or sharing files, consider, are the scale, complexity, and patterns in the data well suited to mapping? For example, is my map of child care supply, demand, or unmet need really just a map of population? Is the map helping to tell a story of the data, or might it be oversimplifying or complicating the data? Always consider alternative or supplemental approaches, including other forms of data visualization and tabling well suited to your goals. This concludes today's Mapping 101. Thanks to everyone for your attention, and now I'll turn it back to Julia.
Well, thanks, Erica. You covered quite a bit there, and so I'd like to pause to take questions. Does anyone have questions for Erica or me? Please type your questions into the chat box, and I'll ask Ellie to read them to the group. We welcome audience participation either now, during this pause, or at any point during the presentation. Do you have questions?
Yes. So our first question is, what commute times do you use from the census to define non-standard hours?
That's a great question, and our data analyst from the project will remember the details better. I believe it's the overall start time combined with the amount of time reported for the commute, but we would have to go back to the technical details of the report to confirm. You can find the report on the Urban Institute website, and there should be more information there.
Yeah, I think, isn't the ACS unusual in that it actually asks you about commute time? That's my memory of it being unusual. Well, I mean, yes. But not every survey, you wouldn't think a survey would have that, so that you can use that.
Yeah. Great. And then our next question is, can you overlay provider supply over public transportation routes or availability?
Yes, absolutely. Public transportation is often provided in base maps, either by municipal or state governments, or sometimes it's included in mapping software. And so that's a really nice way to get some context for the data that you're visualizing.
Great. And then, someone asked if you offer hands-on training on this subject matter.
So far, this has been the hands-on training that I've done to date, and then at last year's CCEEPRC conference, at the end of the presentation, I prepared a slide that includes the names of 4 different websites that have useful tutorials where you can find more information, and if there's interest, I'd be happy to do this again for many audiences.
And then if we have time for one more, someone asked if you could talk about which mapping software you use to create these maps.
These maps were created with ArcGIS, which I mentioned is the industry standard. It has the largest number of capabilities, and really allows for customizable maps, but it is expensive and it can be clunky, so it is not always the best tool depending on your project.
Well, thank you for those questions, and thank you, Erica, for being willing to just sort of jump in to provide the answers. It does make it more interactive, so thank you. I'm going to go on to our next slide, which shows you our next two presenters. Our first presenter will be Chad Dorn, who's worked as a research partner to the CCDF lead agency in Pennsylvania on their CCDBG implementation research and evaluation planning grant. That's a mouthful. Chad is a research and policy advisor at Propulsion Squared, and he will talk about how mapping has been used to inform policy decisions in Pennsylvania. Second, we'll hear from Katherine Ferg, who's a research analyst at the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. I think you'll find both presentations interesting, and they give additional concrete examples of how mapping can be useful to CCDF lead agencies. Please remember that if you have questions for either of them, you can type them into the chat box, and Eleanor will share them with us at the end of the webinar. Let me turn it over to you, Chad.
Thank you, Julia, and good afternoon, everyone. As Julia mentioned, my name's Chad Dorn, and I'm a research and policy advisor for Propulsion Squared. I worked with Pennsylvania's Office of Child Development and Early Learning, which you'll hear me refer to as OCDEL during this presentation, to strengthen their capacity to map early care and education supply and demand. OCDEL is a dual deputate, which means that it's connected to both the Department of Education, which is led by Secretary Rivera, and the Department of Human Services, who's led by Secretary Miller. So our work in Pennsylvania followed this cycle of inquiry that you see on your screen. So first, we reviewed resources and examples of mapping. We found great examples from the Center for American Progress, Childcare Aware, and of course the Urban Institute. We also used our network to speak directly with other states to learn from their experiences. Second, we decided on the technical aspects of the inquiry. For example, we made decisions about how to define demand, which can be estimated based on age of children, whether they are below an economic threshold or have working parents. We also learned that the preferred definition varies by the intended audience. We also chose an appropriate tool. And as Erica pointed out, there's various to choose from depending on the complexity of the task. Could be Tableau, could be ArcGIS, or even could be QGIS. Third, we collected and cleaned the data. Now, the source of the data can be administrative data, data from the American Community Survey or US Census, or surveys from providers. An important step to review is to review the geolocations for any inconsistencies, like an address that's listed as a PO box, or a location for an after-school program that doesn't serve children ages 0 to 5. Fourth, we analyzed the data and mapped it. And then finally, we repeated this cycle as often as we needed to. Our first project focused on identifying childcare deserts, which Childcare Aware defines as areas or communities with limited or no access to quality childcare. We followed the process outlined in this graphic from the Center for American Progress to identify if a census tract was indeed a childcare desert. So if a tract did not have at least 50 children ages 0 to 5, it was not considered a desert. For the tracts with at least 50 children, it was considered a desert if the tract did not have at least one childcare provider. If the tract had at least one provider, the ratio of children to capacity was then calculated. If that ratio was more than 3 to 1, it was identified as a desert. And if the ratio was less than 3 to 1, it was not a desert. To estimate supply and demand, we collected appropriate data. For supply of childcare, we utilized the number of licensed spaces, which we were able to gather from OCDEL's administrative data. An important detail to note is that in Pennsylvania, this number is determined during the licensing process and determined based on a calculation of square footage, which is not a perfect estimate of supply. We also removed providers that didn't serve children ages 5 and below. We then calculated demand 2 different ways using 2 related data sources. First, to estimate the number of children ages 0 to 5, we used 2010 US Census data. Second, to estimate demand by the number of children living below 200% of the federal poverty level, we used American Community Survey 5-year estimates data. Finally, we chose census tracts as the unit of analysis, and then geolocated tracts and providers using ArcGIS. For this example of establishing supply and demand estimates for access to childcare, we see the visualization of the results for Pennsylvania. The orange areas on the map are the tracts identified to be childcare deserts. The gray areas are the tracts that are not. In Pennsylvania, 52% of census tracts are childcare deserts. It's important to note that in this statewide map, it's difficult to see the census tracts in densely populated areas that are childcare deserts. You can only see the black boundary lines at this scale. However, the scale is helpful in that it helps to identify where we should zoom in to take a closer look. This next map is zoomed in to focus on Early Learning Resource Center, Region 5, which covers Allegheny County in the southwestern part of the state. Again, the orange areas identify the childcare deserts. There are 19 ELRC regions in Pennsylvania. ELRCs are administrative regions designed to promote collaboration and coordination of services for providers and children and families. So in Region 5, 50% of the census tracts are childcare deserts, and 54% of children ages 5 and below live in a childcare desert. 56% of children in households that make below 200% of the federal poverty level live in a childcare desert in this ELRC region. Incorporating local input creates better understanding of any barriers and dynamics that contribute to the creation of a childcare desert, as well as identify potential solutions for increasing childcare capacity in those areas. As I mentioned earlier, this work was done as part of an evaluation research partnership. These maps were shared with the internal working group of that partnership. The members of the group had previously used geographic analysis, and this was not their first experience interpreting maps. So consequently, much of their reactions focused on the data behind the visualizations. For example, they identified the limitation of the calculation based on the occupancy number instead of actual or desired capacity. The maps promoted working group members to inquire about creating a more robust picture of the early childhood ecosystem that could include data about Head Start, early Head Start, or state-funded pre-K, or the capacity to serve specific populations like infants and toddlers. They also noted that they didn't have a good understanding of the demand and use of private paid childcare. Compared to the state maps, the ELRC maps were much more valuable for understanding where more local analysis should occur, and those maps would help inform capacity building strategies moving forward. Pennsylvania is currently piloting an infant toddler contracted slots program. So Octal used their CCDBG implementation research and evaluation grant to plan for the implementation of that pilot. During the planning process, Octal sought to, 1, develop supply and demand estimates, and 2, identify areas where contracts could close the supply and demand gaps, and 3, examine the infrastructure that's needed to implement the pilot. During the process of estimating supply and demand for infants and toddlers, we came up against a couple of obstacles. We were not able to calculate specific capacity for infants and toddlers because Pennsylvania doesn't gather age-specific estimates of supply. Instead, they collect the overall occupancy capacity I mentioned earlier. For demand, we use 3 years worth of yearly estimates from the American Community Survey's data of women ages 16 to 50 who had a birth in the past 12 months. Another obstacle was that it was also difficult to include income eligibility estimates for children ages 0 to 3. This time we used zip code tabulation areas, which Erica explained in a slide earlier, which are kind of similar to postal zip codes and larger than census tracts, because we felt they reduced the margin of errors for the estimates. This map of Pennsylvania identifies the location of childcare providers, which are shown as the red dots on the map. The blue color scale shows the concentration of infants and toddlers. The darker the color blue, the more infants and toddlers in that area. One of the first things you see are the clusters of childcare options, which concentrate in more densely populated areas of the state. The map also shows areas where darker shades of blue that do not have childcare providers are located. These indicate an area for more analysis to be done. The findings from this analysis were one factor that Octal used to locate the first cohort of contracted slots pilot programs. So I'll end with a couple of key takeaways from Pennsylvania's experience using mapping. First, local input strengthens the analysis and interpretation of maps and informs local action plans to address maps. However, to harness that strength, it's important to develop mechanisms to engage and collect feedback from local and regional partners. Second, mapping is an effective tool to inform the planning stage of program implementation. For example, it helps identify areas where infrastructure should be strengthened or developed. And last, mapping will highlight inconsistencies in your administrative data, which can inform the development of strategies to collect even better data on childcare access. So thank you everybody for your time. And Julia, I will turn the presentation back over to you.
Thanks, Chad. So if you have questions for Chad, just type them into the question box. But I'm going to move forward to our next slide. Oops, there we go. And we're going to turn to Katherine Ferg of the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. Katherine?
Thanks, Julia. My name is Katherine Ferg, and I'm a research analyst with the Department of Children and Families in Wisconsin. I'm excited to talk to you about the mapping work that Wisconsin has been doing. What is Wisconsin mapping? Wisconsin has been engaged in mapping a variety of administrative data over the last several years, including Childcare Deserts, similar to the work Chad just presented from Pennsylvania, the location and quality of regulated childcare providers, changes of in-home childcare providers, as well as our childcare subsidy participants, the location of major employers and their location to childcare providers, as well as information from our market rate surveys. The Department of Children and Families has been extensively utilizing mapping as an effective tool to visualize and understand Wisconsin's landscape. Today, I'm going to discuss in detail just one of the mapping activities Wisconsin has done and how we moved through the process of utilizing mapping. There are three main steps. The first step is to identify the data request. For this project, our request was how has the availability of regulated childcare changed over time in Wisconsin? The next step, we gathered the appropriate data. We used administrative data of all regulated childcare providers from March 2012 all the way to March 2019, including the latitude and longitude coordinates for each of our regulated childcare providers. The last step is to visualize the data. Wisconsin is currently using Tableau as a data visualization tool. Using the data we collected, we can begin to work through the descriptive statistics and consider the most appropriate way to visualize the data to maximize understanding. In this instance, one of the ways to effectively look at this data and answer the original request was to produce a map and incorporate a time series that shows the latitude and longitude of each provider who is active over time. This map of the state of Wisconsin shows the latitude and longitude point of each provider in Wisconsin. Referring to Erica's presentation, this is an example of a dot map. Each dot is colored by the regulation type of the provider. The orange colored dots represent our certified providers who can care for a small number of children, typically in their home. Wisconsin certified providers are sometimes referred to as license exempt or home-based care providers in other states. The blue colored dots represent our licensed family providers who can care for up to 8 children, typically in their home. The gray colored dots are Wisconsin's licensed group providers or center-based providers who can care for more than 8 children, typically at a location other than their home. The last dark gray colored dots are other regulated providers, which include our public school programs. Pressing play on this map shows how the dots of the location of our active providers change from 2012 to 2019. Although the statewide map can be helpful to globally understand what's happening across the whole state, using a statewide view in this instance doesn't lend itself to understanding the impact of our provider location over time. I will play the time series one more time and try focusing on the change of certified providers or the orange dots. You can notice a general decline in the number of certified providers across the state. However, this still isn't very informative.
1 minute, I had trouble playing it the second time. Hang on, here we go again. Now they can watch the orange. Katherine, I think I should do it. I'll do it one more time.
Okay.
Watch the orange dots. There we go. Okay, now I'll go on.
The next series of maps shows just 2 counties in Wisconsin, Bayfield and Ashland. By zooming into a much smaller, more specific area in Wisconsin, trends in regulated childcare providers are more informative to the audience. When I press play, the number of certified providers, or the orange dots, does decrease over time, but there's also a shift in providers located right along the Bayfield-Ashland border. There's a decrease in regulated providers in Bayfield County and an increase in providers in Ashland County, right along that Bayfield-Ashland border. We will play it one more time. Knowing the shift has happened so closely to the county border allows stakeholders and policymakers to understand childcare need and access in this area much differently than if we only told them that there was a 42% decrease of providers in Bayfield County. Utilizing mapping allows policymakers and stakeholders to easily identify the shift between county borders, something that county level descriptives would have made very difficult to identify. Maps can be an integral part to understanding data, specifically when working with state policymakers. Beginning with descriptive statistics of the data is often the best way to get a good understanding of the data set as a whole. This can tell you if maps would be a useful tool, and if so, identify the types of maps that would be useful. Starting with descriptive statistics can also tell you which area of the state should be targeted in the mapping. Now that you've gotten a good sense of the data set, looks like moving into mapping can add invaluable context to your analysis. Utilizing maps can help a wide variety of stakeholders understand complex data in terms like Childcare Deserts. Maps can add context with the data, especially as you narrow into smaller areas, as we noticed in the Bayfield-Ashland example. Mapping, when appropriate, is an excellent tool to bring a variety of audiences together, promoting active discussion around data. Wisconsin is continuing to grow their use of mapping, which will continue to support our mission of data-driven decision-making. Mapping work has led to the identification of areas where we could enhance our data collection. Similar to what Chad in Pennsylvania had stated, Wisconsin doesn't currently have the capacity or enrollment of each provider by age group. So we're unable to talk as accurately as we would like about the availability of childcare for infants and toddlers, for example. Looking forward, Wisconsin has also begun to grow our capacity in mapping software, including the use of ArcGIS, which would allow for spatial analysis like calculating the distance between major employers and childcare providers. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to discuss mapping, the mapping work Wisconsin has been doing. And with that, I will turn it back to Julia.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Katherine. And thank you, Chad. It's just helpful to hear how people are doing this in their own states. So we are open to comments or reflections. If you have a question or a comment, just type it into the chat box. Eleanor, are there any questions that came in during the presentation?
Yes, we got a lot.
Okay.
So there's a couple for Chad, so I'll start with those and then we'll move on to the rest. So our first question is, how did you define quality childcare, and does it address parents' needs as well as child-focused services?
And Eleanor, that question is for me. Is that what you said?
Yes.
So quality childcare in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's QIRS system has 4 stars. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being the highest. Generally speaking, star 3 and 4 are deemed kind of the highest quality levels. For the Childcare Deserts, though, we didn't make any distinction on the quality of care. We mapped all care types.
Great, thanks. And then another question for you, Chad. Someone wrote, our state has a couple of large employers. When a census tract shows an overabundance of childcare, it could be that children are brought close to their parents' work. So how does that affect the assumptions?
I think one of the things that MAPS does really well is show those big gaps like you would see with a large employer in a specific area. An example that comes to mind is of an airport. I know some mapping has been done in other parts of the state where they identified that there was a large quality childcare gap right around the airport because parents were going there. So that it's common and it's fairly easy to see from maps. The smaller gaps are not as obvious to see through the visualization. However, with that said, it does impact the assumptions, but that's when the local input is really important to help analyze and interpret what might be some of the dynamics and kind of motivators for the gaps that exist. So local input can help you analyze the maps and then also address where there might be policy mechanisms that need to be changed in order to create more care in that area.
There's some nodding heads around here. I wanted to say something and I'll turn to my colleague Teresa. It's just this issue between where people live and where people reside. We live right here, we're speaking to you from the District of Columbia, where it's not just crossing county boundaries. You may easily work in one state and live in one state and work in another. And so when we count up the childcare that's available in Northern Virginia or in, anyways, that issue that the commenter raised, that these maps often do not catch the fact that where the person lives is not where they're using their childcare. Teresa, I may have said what you wanted to say, but what were you going to jump in with, please?
Yeah, something similar to that. So sometimes I think what the person writing was referring to was that you might actually see more childcare in a space where people are not living because there is an employer. So maybe there's a hospital or another large entity where the parents want the kids close to them while they're working, and so they're commuting with their children, and that's where the childcare is. But the map might show no need based on residences. And then what Chad said is the opposite, where you might think, well, where are all the child care programs that you would think should be here? But there's some either big employer that takes up a lot of land space like an airport, or some other geographic feature that prevents child care from being located there, like a lake or something else. And that is where it's really important to talk to folks on the ground to understand what's going on. And I think that map that Katie showed us with the two counties next to each other, and the distinctions that both Chad and Katie talked about, when you look bigger, you can see some things, and when you look smaller, you can see some things, and it's just really important to have those on-the-ground conversations to understand what it is that you are seeing, and not to either look too big or too small. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Teresa. Other questions?
Yes, so this one is for Katie, I believe. A commenter wrote, California has restrictions on dot mapping of small family childcare, those licensed for 6 to 8 children, so we often use heat maps. Do you have similar restrictions on mapping?
In Wisconsin, we don't. Our in-home or our smaller providers, we do, it's public information on where those are located. So we are able to map them. That doesn't speak to exactly how many children they're enrolling or any other identifying information on the children that are actually at that licensed family or that certified or in-home provider.
One of the many examples of state-to-state variation. I appreciate that reminder from California. So interesting, the information is public in one state and not public in another.
Great. And then I have a question for all the panelists. So it says, do any of the panelists have experience with interactive maps which enable the user to select a geographic area of their choice?
This is Katie from Wisconsin. One of the benefits of Tableau as a visualization tool is that we're able to combine a map with basically a filter. And so the user is able to select a county or a particular zip code or a region and zoom into that area and get information on exactly what they're looking for. And so it's a little more user driven.
Yeah, I think I've seen an example of that, of your dashboard. This is Julia. I've seen an example of that dashboard, Katie, where, and I'm trying to remember, is that for the people within the agency can filter it, or is that a public website?
Currently, it's internal, but it is going to go external facing. So it will be for the public to be able to use and filter down from the state to a particular county that they're interested in.
Interesting.
And one more quick question for all the panelists. For those using ArcGIS, are you using ArcGIS Online or the desktop version, or both?
I've historically used ArcGIS, the desktop version, but I know that ArcGIS Online is catching up, and sometimes it even works more smoothly in handling large data sets. So the technology is changing quickly. I think if you have the capacity, it's worth trying both versions and seeing which works best for you.
Thanks, Erica.
That's everything.
So at the moment, that's the questions from you. So I actually have some questions for our panelists. So Chad, I've heard you a couple of times talk about getting local input. And can you say a little bit more? I mean, does this mean you take your maps and travel out to places, or you do a Zoom webinar like this? What's the process of getting engaging with local and regional partners and collecting feedback from them? I'm just curious what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Julia. So as I said before, Pennsylvania has these early learning resource center regions whose purpose is to coordinate and collaborate activities. And some of those activities could include regional coordination activities like community planning. So the ELRCs are a great local point of contact. In Pennsylvania, the maps, you could take the maps and give them over to the ELRCs, and within their own kind of internal working group, be able to look at those maps and provide feedback on them. If you could have a state employee, part of your staff that was producing the maps, go and address any questions they have, help them interpret it, that would be great. I think the easy part is to share the information out with the community, whether it's community stakeholders, whether it's for advocacy, whether it's other community organizations. I think the sharing part is fairly straightforward. I think the tricky part is being able to get the information back from them. So creating some type of formal mechanism to gather their information and be able to act on it. So perhaps when they're looking at the maps, they start asking questions about what type of additional data or research would they need in order to be able to better understand the local context of their deserts or the supply and demand of care. Or do they want to begin to map at their local level by themselves? Does a local ELRC want to develop that capacity to do that? And if so, do they need technical assistance that the state could provide to support them in developing that? Or do they even need the resources such as software in order to do that? And then finally, is there infrastructure that they need help from the state to be able to implement or to develop in order to address the care? Or is it something that they can do to be able to kind of convene resources and coordinate resources at the local level? But if that can be gathered and then brought back to the kind of the central state agency, then that allows the state to see if there's any trends across the state from the local ELRCs that the state could maybe take some action on.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. I appreciate that distinction between it's a little easier to share the data, the maps. I guess if you have maps, people know what county they live in and they can look at them. And if you have these, I'm sure pretty sure every state has administrative regions and share it with them. But that collecting feedback is a little bit harder, but definitely worth doing. Katie, could you also say more about ways that you have in Wisconsin that you've been sharing the maps either with state or with county partners or other regional partners?
Yeah, so some of the ways that Wisconsin typically engages either our people within our agency or our county partners or any of our other external stakeholders is to either give them data at the level we decide, so that's giving a particular county or a region the maps and the data on just their region, or doing kind of what we had already talked about with a dashboard version. So that's giving them access to the entire state and allowing the user to kind of filter through the data. They can select a region or they could select a county and they could look at the zip codes, and they almost drive what's happening and let their own questions kind of be answered. I think regardless of the way we've done it, whether we've given them the level of data that we've decided, whether it's county or regional, or allowed them to pick the level that they want to look at, the benefit of doing either one is it always generates so many questions and great discussions. And so when we talk and we start presenting maps, people can really start to grasp what's happening, like we saw in the Ashland and Bayfield County. When you show that map, it's really easy for people to start asking questions and discussing, well, what's happening? Why have these providers shifted just slightly over the county border? Is something happening in that county? Is there a major employer that just shifted over the border? And so that's why we see this slight shift. And so it really just opens up a lot of discussion and really good questions.
Thank you, Katie. I did get the sense from other things I heard you and others in Wisconsin saying that there are people like me who love tables, but there are people who don't like tables and numbers, and that you can, with a map, you can engage with some policymakers that are maybe harder to engage with when you're showing them tables. I did hear you, Erica, say that while maps can engage with people, sometimes the maps can be a little bit, misleading. I mean, the visual representation is so powerful. But sometimes a person looking at the map may not realize that the underlying data are, still partially under development. I don't know, is it case by case, or do you have any tips about how to know when a map is a good method and when it might be better to use a table or something else?
Sure. So you can decide whether to map in a couple of ways, and then obviously there are the case-by-case decisions as well. In general, first, at the start of a new analysis, you might decide whether to map based on the available data and your goals. Or second, once the analysis is underway and you see the results of preliminary mapping, you may decide whether to move forward and share your maps with broad audiences, or whether additional Approaches to data visualization or tabling might be preferred. On the first way of deciding, if your intention is to share specific numbers, for example, for reporting purposes, or to look at differences across multiple types of providers, children, families, and communities, tables really can be a much easier way to share findings and have readers process the results. On the second way of deciding, you may move ahead with a mapping project only to discover that mapping doesn't add any new information or help make existing information more digestible, might not help you tell the story of your data. So for example, some maps of supply and demand can simply be maps of population, showing where people are clustered and where they're not. Of course, having those conversations with stakeholders can help you decide how to refine maps and whether they are ultimately useful for your goals. Finally, your decisions about mapping can be guided by whether you would be sharing static maps or making interactive mapping tools, as that good question just referenced. So interactive mapping tools can be great sources of information for various consumers, but of course they're more costly than a table of licensed providers, for example, or another search tool so that families, for example, might have more information about the available options in their communities. Ultimately, cost, map type, underlying data, intended audience, and your project goals can all inform the decision about when to map.
Thanks. Chad or Katie, do you have any other cautions about maps that you want to throw in at this point?
This is Chad. I think the only caution that I would reiterate is the visualizations are only as strong as the quality of the data that sits behind them. So in the process that we went through in Pennsylvania, the actual mapping, the visualization part was at the very end, almost the last step of the process. There was quite a bit of work that goes into gathering, collecting, analyzing, cleaning all the data so that you can get really great visualization. So spend the time on the data analysis part in order to get the really high quality maps.
This is Katie. I would agree with everything that Erica and Chad have said. I would also say that for us in Wisconsin, mapping has been really exciting lately. It's been new, it's been exciting, and people have asked for maps. The one problem with when someone comes to you and says, I would like something mapped, is that the data and the question may not always be appropriate for the use of a map. And so I would kind of caution that although maps can be very exciting and people can really like them, that it's definitely not always the tool to use.
Thank you. I realize I shouldn't dominate the questions. Are there any other questions that have come in, Eleanor?
No.
Okay. I do have, it relates to what you just said, Katie. I had one more set of questions. So Katie, you said it was sort of new, and sort of my question is, how long has your agency been doing maps like this? And I'm also curious how long you've been doing it. And the reason I ask is because I'm imagining some people listening in who are not doing mapping who might wonder, how much time does it take to do all this? And what types of analysts do they need to hire? What kind of training do they need to provide? So I guess that's a lot of questions at once, but I'll go back to my question, I guess for you, Katie. How long has your agency been working on mapping, and how long have you been working on this?
So Wisconsin has been doing mapping for many years, specifically just more heavy mapping on using ArcGIS, and it was very limited to just a few people who happened to have the software and happen to know how to use it. More recently, we've had a push to Tableau for data visualization, and because we've pushed to Tableau, it's made mapping and interactive dashboards a little bit easier and more seamless to do. And because of the ease in which we can map using Tableau and how easy it is to learn Tableau, there's been a more of like a boom of mapping around Wisconsin lately.
That's great. That's helpful. That sort of helps me picture it a little bit more. And I'm going to ask Chad the same question, but Katie, I'm going to ask you a very so adding the latitude and longitude, so like the computer does that for you, right? You enter a bunch of addresses and the computer spits out the latitudes and longitudes, but is it really that simple?
So Tableau can't personally take in the address, you know, the street number and everything from a childcare provider and turn it into a latitude and longitude very easily. What Tableau does better is if I'm already able to get a data set that includes the latitude and longitude point, when I put it in, Tableau can seamlessly map that almost instantly. So the difference between ArcGIS or other softwares and Tableau is Tableau really works better when it has either latitude and longitude of a particular point, or it has the zip code or county identifiers. Then it can map pretty easily.
Got it. So some of the maps are done with latitude and longitude, and some of them are done with other identifiers.
Right.
So Chad, sort of the same question for you, a little bit about, you know, how many years one has to learn about this, a little bit more about what it would be like if someone wanted to do this at home, if I can use the word home for people's offices, to take this back and do it at home.
Sure. I mean, I think kind of jokingly, if I can figure out how to do it, everybody can figure out how to do it. I began to do it probably 10 years ago, and I originally just started using Google Fusion tables, which had a mapping feature in them. And I was trying to work with local nonprofits to help them understand where they were administering service or where their clients were. And I just continued to build on that experience and got more sophisticated over time. I think now the tools have gotten to be so good that the learning curve is much less than it was before. So I think somebody with a little bit of initiative can probably learn how to map it in the first project and then continue to get more and more in depth over time. And so to kind of further answer your question about latitude and longitude, there are a number of free services that will do geocoding for you. That's if you put in an address, it will give you a latitude and longitude. Google Maps will do that. You can put in one address, it will give you the latitude and longitude. But if you have a large data set, like all of the providers in your state where it's thousands of addresses, there's free, and then you can also pay to have it done, what's called batch geocoding. So you upload a CSV file that has all of the addresses, and then it will locate them and give you a report out on a CSV file of all of the latitude and longitudes, which then you can put into Tableau as Katie described, or ArcGIS, or any of the other programs, and map the location that way.
And I see Erica nodding her head. We'll let her jump in, and now I'll turn to Teresa too.
Sure. So I'd recommend the free geocoders from many state and local governments. Those are often the most up-to-date and will give you the most accurate results of trying to derive latitude and longitude points from street addresses. As Chad mentioned, the match rate is not always 100%, so that's an additional step in the geospatial data analysis process. You might want to go back using Google Maps or other tools to find any addresses that didn't match with the longitude and latitude and see if you might be able to recover them. And then just be clear in presenting any data, whether it was all the points that you had you were able to visualize, or whether there might be some left out and what the implications might be for your findings.
Teresa, this would be a good time for you to jump in.
Sure. So first, I will say I am not the technical expert on mapping. And as some of you know, I came to Urban after having worked in the field in childcare resource and referral. And I would just encourage folks to check in with their resource and referral agencies about whether or not they have already geocoded the providers. The functions at that level mean that sometimes they do that so that they can help parents figure out those commute things. You know, maybe they're looking for childcare between where they live and where they work. And so what I would just suggest is before a state does that they check to see if any of their contractors or service providers have done that kind of thing, including the CCR&Rs.
Well, thanks, Teresa. I did think maybe it was a dumb question, like how do you get addresses into the longitude and latitude? But I'm glad, you know, the dumb questions, I feel like I've learned a lot in the last I've learned a lot in the last hour, but I've learned a lot. I appreciate all that. So before I turn, we have 4 final slides that we're going to ask some feedback from you all, and I want to share those resources with the tutorial and all. I just want to know if anyone on the panel would want to make any closing comments. And I guess I'll start with Erica, and then Chad, and then Katherine.
Just thank you, Julie, and the Center for this opportunity. As Chad was mentioning, the interest and capacity, and as Katie was describing, the excitement about mapping has really grown over the last decade or so, and so we're here to help. Please let us know as questions come up as you embark on these projects and how we can facilitate really high-quality mapping throughout the field of child care.
Thank you, Erica. Chad?
The one thing that I will mention is we talked about mapping services. One of the things that mapping is really great for is advocacy. So maps allow just you know, citizens within a state to be able to learn about their geographic region, about their congressional district, and then be able to use that information to advocate on behalf of children and families in their area.
Thanks, Chad, for adding in that important point and rounding out what we've been talking about. Katherine?
Yeah, I think I would just say for Wisconsin, you know, it's been wonderful to grow our mapping here in the Department of Children and Families, and that's mostly because of the conversations it's generated not only within our state agency, but also at the regional level, whether it's with employers or our CCR&Rs or other stakeholders. Just that conversation that's been able to happen around simply showing a map has been invaluable.
Yes, thank you. I keep hearing that, and I've been less involved at that ground level, but that sometimes the map opens up a conversation, that the questions and conversations that come out of the map are just really exciting for folks. So thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you, for your presentations and your participation in this panel. I want to thank those of you who have been listening. And I have a favor to ask you, which is to provide us some very quick feedback so we can tailor our future webinars to meet your needs. So Ellie, you want to post the poll questions. I think both poll questions will show at once. The first question is, please select, it's either the version of agree or disagree option that best represents your perspective on the following statement. As a whole, the webinar was a good use of my time. And then, as you're answering that, I think if you scroll down, I hope that's the way it works on your screen, you'll see the second question. Please select the option that best represents your perspective on the following statement. My knowledge or skills have increased as a result of the session. Well, I'm not allowed to vote, but mine have. Let me wait while you select your option. Okay, Eleanor's telling me that you've been selecting. Thank you very much. Oh, let me leave it open so you have time to select both. Answer both. Okay, we've closed the poll. Thank you. So let's go to, I'm the one advancing the slides. Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, there we go. Erica, could you say a word about, this is where those tutorials are that you were talking about earlier.
Exactly, yes. We wanted to share some resources so that folks had some, not exactly homework, but some easily available information on the things that we've been talking about today. So first, anytime you'd like to map census data, the easiest place to check for that data aligned with spatial information is the IPUM's National Historical Geographic Information System. We've got the link there. And NHGIS allows you to easily download tabular census, American Community Survey, and other data linked to the geographies that they represent. So that really saves you a step of having to align things or crosswalk. And it's a wonderful, really easy to use site. And then we list several mapping tutorials here. They all have strengths. ArcGIS offers their own tutorials specific to their software. And then centers at Harvard University, the University of Chicago, and Stanford all offer really excellent, easy-to-use, user-friendly webinars and videos that can help you to get started mapping.
Thank you. Wish I had some free time I'm of the older generation that hasn't learned mapping yet, and I wish I had some free time to do those webinars, but I don't. I'm giving you a moment to write down the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard University, or the Center for Spatial Data Science at the University of Chicago, or Stanford Geospatial Center. You'd have to Google on them. We will send these slides out, but it will take us a few months. On this final slide, I want to point out to other resources not necessarily related to mapping, although the first one is. You know, the OPRE website, which I think you're all familiar with, is about to come out with a brief on geospatial analysis. And so when that link is available, we'll try to inform you. And the slides, audio recording, and transcripts from the first webinar are going to be posted any day now. I was hoping it would be before today, but it will be any day now, and we will send out an email when it comes up. The final resource I want to recommend to you is and you can Google this, the Center for Supporting Research on CCDBG Implementation, which is hosted here at Urban. We also will be posting the slides from the first webinar. We have the other resources we have less related to mapping. We have this, it's really an annotated bibliography. It's called Research and Evaluation Capacity Building, a resource guide for Child Care and Development Fund lead agencies, and we're revising it. It has questions about administrative data. It talks about how to develop evaluation questions, how to choose an evaluator, the types of things we think would be useful for CCDF lead agencies. We also have other resources. We have a forthcoming research brief on how to procure research and evaluation services. And finally, we are planning for our third national webinar in the winter of 2020. We will email you when the registration is open for that, as well as alert you when the slides and other things are posted. Finally, if you have any questions or comments on this webinar or webinar series, feel free to email me, Julia Isaacs, and I have jisaacs@urban.org as my email address. So final thank you to our presenters in the room and remotely, and we will sign off until the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.